Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Michael Kaufman. I'm a research scientist, have my PhD in environmental sciences, and have been doing research for over 30 years in that particular field. It was about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I began to realize exactly what was going on with the environmental movement. In fact, I was leading a multi-million-dollar research effort on the effects of acid rain and global climate change when I began to realize that the environmental community, both nationally and internationally, was not really interested in protecting the environment, contrary to what most of you believe, but in advancing an agenda to control the world. That's no overstatement. It is literally happening right now. I wish we could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about it, but obviously we don't have the time for that. As a consequence, I want to focus on just 3 primary areas of prophecy, because not only was I a research scientist, but I was a student of prophecy. I even developed an 11-week course in which we just finished one segment of it for the whole community, the community that I live in, where we look at the prophetic events in Daniel, Revelation, New Testament, Old Testament in detail to look at exactly what might be coming, what has happened already and what might be coming yet in the future. As a result of that, I have a fairly good background in what is happening prophetically today. And as I mentioned momentarily ago, I want to focus on just 3 areas. I can't possibly cover everything that I covered over an 11-week period. But I want to just take 3 major prophecies that we have. I think most people are interested, even non-Christians are interested. One is the so-called one world government and one world religion. Another is the 10-nation confederacy, the 10 horns of Daniel and Revelation. And the third, out of Revelation chapter 13, is the mark of the beast. The mark, or 666, that has always had the world so enthralled. Now, many generations, all through since the time of Christ, have believed that they're the generation in which Christ was going to return. However, he has obviously not returned. And I have to ask myself, is this one of those times? Do we see certain signs that seem to be the fulfillment of prophecy and Christ is going to return right now? Well, I have to believe that it's imminent, because never in the history since Christianity was born has there been so many prophecies concerning the end times being fulfilled right in front of our eyes. Does that mean it's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next year? I have no idea, because Jesus Christ said that we will never know. But he said to look at the signs of the times. And as the fig tree begins to bloom, realize that the time is near. And I believe we're in that time. It may be another 20 or 30 years. I don't know. But so much has happened in the last 10 to 15 years that it's hard for me to imagine it's going to take another 30 years to happen. Okay, so let's go to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 is, as many of you recognize, the chapter in which Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Now, Daniel, if you recall, has been sent into exile. He's been chosen to be a sorcerer, a prophet for the king, Nebuchadnezzar. And he is thrown in with this group of men that were supposed to advise Nebuchadnezzar as to what he should do and what he should not do. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He dreamt something that was very, very intriguing, but he just didn't understand what it meant. So he called his sorcerers to him. Daniel was not included. He was away at the time. And he asked the sorcerers not only what the dream meant, but he asked them to define what the dream was without telling them. Now, that's quite a feat. And when they could not tell him what he had dreamt, he said, unless you can do that, you are all going to be killed. I'm going to kill you because you're obviously not a true sorcerer. And as a consequence of that, he set out the edict that all of these sorcerers and magicians and astrologers and so forth should be put to the sword unless they tell him what he dreamt and then interpreted what he dreamt to what it really means. And as a result of that, as Daniel came back and he found out about this, he was one of the sorcerers that would be killed. And he and his other friends began to pray. And he finally went to the king and he said, "O king, let me be praying about this for a moment and see what God tells me." So the king said, okay. He went back overnight and he had a dream from God of exactly what it was that Nebuchadnezzar had dreamt. And not only did he dream what Nebuchadnezzar had dreamt, but he also dreamt exactly what it meant. And so he went back to Nebuchadnezzar the next morning and he said, O king, I have this prophecy and this message from you. And then he describes the dream. And then eventually the actual interpretation. And this is what it was. In verse 31 and 35, you looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in its appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. This is what Daniel saw. In essence, an artist's rendition of it. A golden head, which Daniel then said was Nebuchadnezzar. The next was a silver chest and two arms, which turned out to be, in fact, in Daniel chapter 8, it mentions the fact that it is Media and Persia. So the kingdom of Persia and the kingdom of Media combined to form one massive kingdom, and that's what the silver chest represented. Then the third one was Alexander the Great, the thighs of bronze. Alexander the Great came across all of the known world about that time in astonishing speed, literally defeating the Persian Empire, crumbling before his advance. And then finally, the Roman Empire, one of the longest-lived empires in human history. But it's interesting that if you look at the Roman Empire, the two legs representing one Rome and two Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, because they actually split at the end and made two, just like the two arms of medieval Persia. But there was something else that was very interesting. In verse 40, he goes on to say, finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Rome was extremely strong. Again, it conquered all the known world except for the far eastern world. At the time, it was one of the strongest empires the world has ever known. But at the same time, in verse 41, it says, just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, yet it will have some of its strength of iron in it. And as the Roman Empire began to crumble within itself, it began to conquer the northern tribes of Germany and so forth, intermixed with that, and became weaker and weaker and weaker, much like the feet of clay and iron. It was not strong, and yet it was very strong at the same time. Eventually, Rome was conquered by the Germans from within. So it fractured from within, much like you would expect a feet made of iron and clay mixed together. In verse 42, it says, as the toes were partially of iron and partially of clay, so this kingdom will be partially strong and partially brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Again, we have a representation of 10 toes. So at the end of time, before Christ returns, there will be 10 kingdoms. This will be divided into 10 kingdoms. And they will be made up of a mixture of clay and iron, just like the legs. They will be exceedingly strong, but at the same time very brittle and will not remain united. Now let's just take a look at the background of what is happening today. Although most people fully do not recognize it, do not realize it, there are 5 global power factions operating in the world today. There are many more, of course, but there are 5 major ones that we are aware of in the evening news, even though they're never described that way. Well, first of all, we have the Anglo-American faction. That is the faction of the banking cartel of Great Britain and the United States, or America. They basically control what is happening, or at least heavily influence what is happening in world events today. It's amazing how many people totally really don't understand why Great Britain always stands at her side, but nobody else does. Well, it's because of the banking cartel. The central banks, the U.S. Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, basically control 1/2 of the monetary flow every day of every year. It is exceedingly powerful.